Let's make it our business. A climate podcast that's about innovators, change makers, and entrepreneurs who are taking actions, creating solutions, and inspiring many. This podcast is supported by US Department of State, created by BBC Media Action, India.
Take a deep breath and tell me, when was the last time you took a deep breath without thinking of the kind of air you were breathing in? My name is Sayema and I welcome you to a podcast that'll make you breathe a little easy. Cool it down, where we are about to see what goes into the air that we breathe in and how we can do something about it. Joining me today is the US Ambassador to India, Mr. Eric Garcetti, and Professor Richard Peltier, who heads the Aerosol Lab at UMass Amherst, which investigates the chemical components of ambient particulate matter that have a significant effect on human health. But before we hear from them how to cool it down, here is a whiff of why it's important. More than 90% of the world's children breathe toxic air every day. That means 1.8 billion children are breathing dirty air right now. But not everyone is holding their breath, hoping that the air would clear up on its own. Some have made it their business. Let's hear them and maybe make it ours too. Our first guest, Mr. Eric Garcetti, is US Ambassador to India. But before that, he had established himself as an eco-champion. Elected as the youngest mayor in the history of Los Angeles in 2013, he chartered a bold green future in his tenure.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Sayema.
All right, Mr. Garcetti, as a mayor of Los Angeles to the chair of C40, a network of 97 of the world's biggest cities taking climate action, to being the current US Ambassador to India, you have seen air pollution on both a local level as well as on global levels. Are there any similarities and differences from your experience?
So I grew up in Los Angeles, a dusty little outpost in the western United States that people know as Hollywood. It's the second largest city and largest metropolitan area in the United States. But it was also a place that was incredibly dirty in terms of the air when I grew up. It was a place where we had smog alerts. In fact, smog, that work of smoke and fog together, came from Los Angeles. When, as Los Angeles industrialized, became an economic powerhouse, grew in population, was an ongoing problem that really affected the health and the well-being of everyone there. In fact, in World War II, there was a smog incident that was so bad, people thought it was a Japanese chemical attack on the western United States. In the 1950s and 60s, it was so bad that mothers used to take gas masks and come to our city hall and demand that there be action taken. And when I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, we would have these things called stage 3 smog alerts. Long before there was an AQI, they would measure the level of pollution, and they would forbid us as students from even going outside at school, playing on the playground. And I remember what it was like to have those burning lungs. And I lived at the intersection of two highways. It was at a time when gasoline was leaded. And I personally know what this issue is about. My mother, my father, my sister, and many of my neighbors have all had cancer. Thankfully, my family has all survived it. But some people didn't. And I'm sure part of the reason we had this cancer cluster was because we were growing up in such polluted air. So this issue is very personal for me. It's something that I lived through. I've seen both the impact negatively of what dirty air, polluted air does to families and communities and cities. But I also know what it's like to work on this successfully, because in Los Angeles, we've been able to clean our air by 90% since I was a child. And this isn't about one country telling another country what to do. This is about human beings who all want to breathe clean air, finding the best practices and the solutions to accelerate healthier lives today. Los Angeles, like northern India, has some of the same geography of mountains that trap pollution. Back in the day, we used to burn trash, have industries that pollute, leaded gas, like I mentioned, spewing out of our cars, and so much more. So it's really, there's no one silver bullet. There's not one solution. It's about creating a network of people who say that human beings should and deserve to have healthy lives, clean air, and if they don't, how can we all work together to achieve that?
Great. You represented the world's urban leaders at COP26 and delivered the city's Race to Zero pledge. Can you unpack what this pledge is about and how we all as individuals can be a part of it?
So I'm very proud to represent my country in another great country, India. But so often we focus just at the national level. We look for world leaders like the Prime Minister here, our President, to come together and agree to do things, when the reality of human life is all those national and international agreements mean nothing if we can't translate them in communities where people live, communities where businesses are based, communities where children go to school, communities where workers work, communities where families congregate. And so it was the greatest honor of my life to lead C40, which is the only group of the top roughly 100 cities of the world's mayors who are engaged in climate action together. And it's an amazing network of people. It's rare when you get to have the mayor, they call it governor of Tokyo, together with the mayor of Seoul and the mayor of Sydney and the mayor of, Guangzhou and the mayor of London and Mexico City and Freetown and Buenos Aires and all these places. Because being a mayor is the same anywhere. I always say good mayors borrow, great mayors steal. And so we look for good ideas around the world and kind of spur each other in a friendly, competitive way to take more action to save our planet. But also, more importantly, we do that not in an abstract global way. We do that in a this block, this street, this neighborhood, this city kind of way. So the city's Race to Zero was something when I was chair, my peers elected me as chair of C40. And leading up to COP26 in Glasgow, we said cities need to make pledges too. This isn't just about national leaders, because national leaders can't make their goals without local governments, state and regional governments doing their part. And so people thought, well, we'll get the 97 cities of C40 to make a pledge. You can't join C40 if you don't have a climate action plan to get to zero carbon, and you're keeping up on your goals. Otherwise, you get kicked out of the group. So it's a very results-oriented kind of organization. But I said 97 isn't enough, even though we represented about 20% of the world's GDP. These cities were a huge chunk of climate action. I said, let's go further, and let's get to 1,000 cities. And people thought it was a crazy goal, but as we started doing this, city after city around the world said, absolutely, we want to do our part. Our constituents are demanding it, especially our youth are calling for it with climate strikes and other things, protests. People want action. And so by the time the COP rolled around, I was lucky enough to be one of the only non-national leaders on the first 2 days as prime ministers and presidents took the stage to give their national pledges to make a pledge on behalf of the world's cities. And when the UN added up our pledge of these cities to get to carbon neutral by 2050, it was the equivalent of the 5th largest country in the world, zeroing out its carbon. So one last point is for those who despair about our climate goals, there's only one country on track to meet the stated international goal of the Paris COP of what we have to do by when we have to do it in order to save the planet from warming too much. And that's Denmark. Everybody else is behind. Some people have met their national goals, which are, slower or bigger. But in terms of the stated scientific goal, there's one country that's on track. On the other hand, more than 2/3 of the C40 cities are on track or ahead of the schedule. And it's not easy to govern a city, I'll tell you that. It's just as complicated politically. Oftentimes we don't have the resources of national or central governments. And my message is to the world, if cities can do it, so too can nations. And if cities can do it, so too can the world. So it's evidence that the hard work that human beings need to take in order to reach our air pollution and our climate goals are absolutely achievable. And cities stand here as evidence of that today.
And I'm absolutely awed by what passion can do. You have done such extensive and intensive work on air pollution. As a mayor of Los Angeles, brought about some absolutely revolutionary changes. What were some of the challenges you faced? Do you foresee the same challenges applying to the Indian landscapes?
Human beings are very innovative, but we hate to change. It's a paradox of humanity that every generation does it totally different. Our parents, if they saw the way we grew up, and if their parents saw the way they grew up, nobody would ever imagine we wouldn't all be on farms, or that we would all be watching boxes with videos on them. They don't even know what a video was, that we would have smartphones, that we'd be putting satellites into space. Each generation innovates, but each generation also doesn't want to change. When I think about in our lifetimes, 70, 80% of the plastic the world has ever used has been in our existence. People can't think of a life without plastic. You talk to people in our state when we were banning plastic bags in grocery stores, you'd think we were taking away their very life. And yet human beings have been able to carry things through our entire existence without plastic bags. As convenient as they are, they come at a cost. So I think for all of us, the toughest things aren't as tough as we think, but politically they can be quite controversial. I think about London creating a no emissions or low emissions zone in the center of their city, with congestion pricing, with outlawing diesel, with changing the way bikes and pedestrians get priorities, or bicycles and pedestrians get priority over vehicles. Those things can be very challenging, forcing people to get out of their car and building out a public transit system. It may not be as quick, may not feel as convenient, even if the time is just the same. These things require human beings to adapt. It requires politicians, I think, to hear and to understand, but also to have the courage sometimes to do things that years later, of course, people will say, thank goodness somebody did that. And air pollution's the same way. No one person's responsible. There's no one thing that's responsible for air pollution. It's many people, it's all of us, and it's many sources. So in order to solve it, it requires a commitment of everybody to say, look, clean air will require us all to give some short-term sacrifice. But the long-term cost of living conveniently or cheaply today is too much to bear. In Delhi, I read something that the estimated life expectancy is 10 years less because of air pollution. You take 20 million people and you think about how many people would still be alive or could be alive if you put that out, if the air pollution doesn't get solved, or what the impact was to my generation. As I mentioned, my family having cancer, some had cancer and didn't survive. Some people died from the air pollution in Los Angeles. The numbers are staggering compared to even a pandemic. And yet we kind of sit here stewing in it, saying maybe someday it'll get solved, but we have higher priorities. What higher priority is there than the number of years we can live, our own health? No economic development goal, no kind of national development goal should ever trump our own health. And in fact, I think the best way in America, what we learned in Los Angeles, when you integrate those two things together, it's not either or. Los Angeles was the strongest economy in America. The time that I was mayor, we had the most job growth. We outpaced New York and Chicago and other places, even as we invested in things like electric vehicles and trucks, as we looked at the operations of our port, which was heavily polluting, and how we could make that greener and reduce things like SOx and NOx emission, which were particular toxins in the air that hit communities, often poor communities, that lived closest to these industrial areas. This is economic justice. It's oftentimes racial and religious justice for minorities who live in areas that are closest to the highest pollution. And in the end, it's something we can all celebrate because people living longer and living healthier means less cost to our system and just better lives for all.
That's so well put. I mean, we've always heard that change is inevitable, but, hearing you, we need to also remind ourselves that we should have the courage to accept the change and sometimes bring in the change, by our initiatives like you've been doing. And I'll keep coming back to your LA model, Mr. Garcetti. It's often seen as a template for a lot of cities combating the same problem. Can you share what parts of that model are best adapted to other urban centers across the world, especially India?
So I think you can look at a set of policies, but one thing I'd encourage any city or government to look at is the kind of governance structure when it comes to air quality. Because air quality and pollution ignores borders. It ignores the border of a city, it ignores the border of a district, it ignores the border of a state. Even nationally and internationally, pollution crosses borders. In fact, I remember days when there's been fires in the United States that pollute other countries and vice versa. Canada, when they had huge forest fires, that was a cause of concern. So pollution really doesn't care where we draw our borders. And thus governance, my suggestion is you have to have something that literally oversees multiple levels of governance. And that's tough because people in power, government doesn't naturally cede power to new entities. But in Los Angeles and in Southern California, we created an air quality management district, so AQMD. And the South Coast, which wasn't Los Angeles, it was the entire area because we have many counties and cities that are in the state of California. This authority was given the power to mandate to every city and every county what the rules were, to ban certain industries, to take the leaded gasoline and change that, to work with companies to create the catalytic converter, which is just a piece of technology put on cars that reduced some of the worst pollution 80% overnight, to stop the burning of trash, to look at the ways that we could later on incentivize zero-emission vehicles, look at cleaner power in basins so that we didn't have coal plants and even natural gas plants and other things firing up in the midst of where people live next door to where they are. Recently, we banned oil drilling. That was something in Los Angeles. We have the largest urban oil field in the world. Los Angeles created about 25% of the world's oil in the 1920s. So we built a city literally on top of oil fields, and you'd have pollution going straight into people's homes from the oil derricks. And we recently banned any new oil drilling, and we're going to phase out the existing drills that are there. So these were some of the things that we did, but it was really the governance of having this AQMD and a California Air Resources Board, which is a state-level entity that can really mandate almost a quasi-judicial entity that doesn't just rely on a legislative body or the passions of the electorate that day saying, no, you can't take this away from me, or I'll burn whatever I'll burn, or you can't force me into this vehicle, or you can't make me walk to work or do these things. They can establish the policies that really do chart the future and have been able to help us have that cleaner tomorrow. Last thing I'll say is looking globally, because as chair of C40, I was able to see some of those best practices elsewhere. It's clear that creating good urban planning, more walkable cities with good public transit, more green spaces, green buildings, having distributed power, like I know India is proposing this great ambitious solar rooftop initiative, making sure people don't burn trash, looking at the places like where we have fireworks and other things that are set off that nobody wants to be the one wedding that doesn't have fireworks, but when you have 200,000 weddings in Delhi in December, they have a collective effect, and during Diwali and other things. Maybe in the future we'll see drone shows instead of having fireworks. These small things that we see around the world where cities have either banned things or built things really have provided a collective volume that's very easy to find. It's just then again, will the political will to implement be done? And it's okay to fail forward. Sometimes you'll implement something and it's not the right way forward. Sometimes there's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but keep trying and keep innovating. Find what works for livability and that also works for the environment, and you'll find the two usually meet.
Superb. Now, you just have to imagine that, you and I are cycling because we're, talking about air pollution. We'll be cycling, and I am an entrepreneur. I have some money that I can put into a business. I want to ask you, do you think there are some untapped areas for entrepreneurs to kind of, take on those projects, get to it, serve the purpose, also make money?
Absolutely. I mean, from green taxis and car share to bike share programs that have been great successes around the world. People live in cities because they want to have a good quality of life. You want to have great restaurants, you want to meet friends, you want to have job opportunities, you want to meet the love of your life, you want to, go someplace and see a concert. But cities are not often planned. They're often unplanned. And whether that comes from flooding and mitigating what happens when there's rains, see that here sometimes in the monsoon season. We have that same problem in Los Angeles. With flooding, whether it's looking at the infrastructure for transportation. You can do everything to reduce your emissions, but if traffic gets worse and worse, those existing cars that run on petroleum continue to drive all of the emissions up. I always encourage folks that if you're going to look to invest, look in something that will make people feel good about that day, but also feel good about tomorrow. How can we have greener buildings that don't leak as much, heat or cool, air in the respective winter and summer times? What can we do to encourage people to create more eco-friendly businesses that invest in cleaning up the air? What can we do to help people in business telecommute so there are fewer trips on the road and people can virtually work 2 or 3 days a week? What can we do as well to make transactions easier? So much of the work that we do, whether it's visiting a doctor, going to a bank, taking care of a bill, often you have to do in person. And if we can reduce the number of trips, a city functions pretty well if you just take a small fraction of the trips off the road. It shuts down when everybody rushes to the streets at the same time. And so I think entrepreneurs who can see that future can make a great, fortune, but more importantly, can really invest in the health of a city and the functioning of a city so that so many of these problems are solved before they start. One of the other things we're doing as a mission here in India too is investing in green businesses, whether they're run by women, whether they're micro enterprises. The work that we're doing to ensure folks have greater accessibility, we're taking USAID, State Department funds and others, and really asking India, where are the places where we can spur more green businesses? As mayor of Los Angeles, about 2/3 of our job growth came from green industries. And we often see that entrepreneurs and communities have those solutions. So one thing I'd also add is it's not just entrepreneurs working citywide or nationwide, but find the green solutions where you are. And those investments that we're making here to help build that US-India bridge is a really critical part of our missions work.
And the one last question that I wanted to ask was, we've spoken about how, cities together, communities together, entrepreneurs coming together can make a difference. But always believed in the power of one. If I have to bring about some change, what is your advice to individuals?
So I think my advice to individuals is threefold. It's in your actions. What can you do individually to reduce emissions today? Can you not fire off a firework at a celebration and find a different solution? Can you not burn trash? Can you maybe take a trip on public transportation instead of your gas-burning individual vehicle? So what can you do yourself? Second, what can you organize inside your community? What can you do to create a better system for trash, a better system when it comes to how construction happens, a better system when it comes to how your community gets around, shops, works, etc. And then the third level is be engaged citizenry. I think government can really bring the structure in that helps accountability when it comes to air pollution. So, those best practices that we found in the United States, in Los Angeles, when we created these air quality management districts, or however India would want to do that, those have been proven and effective. And I think that's something in a democracy that we have a great opportunity to advocate, to meet with our elected officials to say, hey, is this possible? Or if we don't want to do it exactly that way, how can we do it in an indigenous Indian-led way that would really be the Indian way to clean air? But governmental change and legislation, community work together, and then individual choices, I think are the way that we can all feel a little less powerless, which every single day when you wake up and it's polluted air, it just makes you feel powerless. Like, what can I do? We know this is caused by millions of things and people, and what difference will I make? I think if each one of us woke up and said, I'm going to contribute something to bring that AQI down today, that we would all look back and make a huge difference. The last thing I'd say too is don't forget the power of green. Look in your community, make it greener. Plants absorb pollution, and plants will breathe more oxygen. And when we live in places that are just full of concrete, that are paved over, that have no green, not only is it bad for our psyche, it's bad for our bodies and our lungs. And that's something you can do right away. in your community, look for those spaces and those places and those opportunities to add cleaner air by having more plants, more trees, taking care of them. A lot of people do tree plantings, but there's a lot of trees that die. We have to all foster them and keep them going. And you will see not only a healthier day, but I think a healthier life for yourself and your family.
As air pollution looms large, in our country today, India is lucky to have a youth ambassador who's an eco-champion. It was a pleasure speaking to you, Mr. Garcetti.
Great to be with you too, and I can't wait to come back for my entire life and see a greener and cleaner India.
Now that we know why it is so important to cool it down, why should we all contribute to a cleaner, healthier future? Let's hear more on it and also learn what can we do about it. Meet Professor Richard Peltier, who heads the Aerosol Lab at UMass, which investigates the chemical components of ambient particulate matter that have a significant effect on human health. Welcome to our podcast, Cool It Down, Richard.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Sayema. It's great to be here.
So, Richard, it is said that climate change and air pollution are two sides of the same coin. Who better to make us see this connection than you? Tell me, Richard, though we all think we know this in bits and pieces, but how would you sum it up in a few lines?
Well, these are not tangible things that you can see or feel or sense, but both are broad societal problems that know no boundaries at all. At the same time, the impacts of both air quality and climate occur way into the future, which is a time when most of today's decision makers aren't really thinking much about. And while there are certainly some natural sources of air pollution, both air pollution and climate are largely driven by anthropogenic forcing.
Right.
In other words, they're caused by people.
And what are some of the key factors that make air pollution in Indian cities rise to the levels that they are?
Sure. So universally, air pollution comes from three broad sources: international, regional, and local. The international materials are the ones that are often a small contribution to the total amount of air pollution in a city or a region. They're a result of what we call long-range transport. They come from somewhere else, and they're usually a mixture of urban emissions and forest fires and natural sources of air pollution that we see floating around. The regional pollutants, they're often from industrial sectors within a country, and they vary considerably. In India, for example, we know some of these sectors are from agricultural waste burning in the north, or the industrial sectors, like petrochemical refineries in the south, or coal-fired energy production pretty much everywhere across India. And then layer on top of that the local sources to this mixture, the cars and trucks in busy streets, and the small-scale industry, construction, and development-related emissions, and you have quite a toxic stew. And so there's no one answer to your question of what's causing air pollution in Indian cities. It's a combination of all sorts of different materials and sources.
Right, but your studies, what do they show? Which is the main source, which is like the most disturbing source right now as far as India is concerned?
Yeah, so one of the things we see that's most pressing in India is the agricultural waste burning that occurs typically in the autumn, the October, November, December timeframe, that causes huge amounts of air pollution to reach into the sky, and then it spreads across the vast majority of India, affecting New Delhi in the north and Mumbai towards the south, and it really does impact the entire country. And so that's the one that's the big ticket item. Certainly there are urban emissions across different cities. For example, Kolkata has quite a large amount of diesel combustion in vehicles. A lot of these things can be impacting communities. And so, as I said, there's really no one answer to your question. It does require multiple different solutions because there are so many different sectors and there are so many different local emission profiles that we see from city to city across India.
Right. Richard, you've said in one of your interviews that air pollution kills over 7 million people across the world. It shows that there is clearly an urgent need to find solutions. You've seen it from a scientific lens, but can you explain it to us in simple terms, the effect that air pollution has on our health and well-being?
Sure. So on average, a typical human takes about 20,000 breaths per day, and each one is filled with some amount of air pollution that varies. In clean conditions, there's less, and in polluted conditions, there's more. And this material can find its way down into the deepest parts of our lungs when we take that breath, where it either causes a biological reaction at the lung surface when we take that breath, or sometimes it's uptaken into the body, and it's transported somewhere else where it has an effect there. It's not unusual to see how asthma can worsen when air quality is poor. This is an example of how air quality has a direct action in the lung. It causes inflammation and burning and aggravates that asthma. But we also see things like cardiovascular disease, how that's aggravated with the pollution exposure. And that means that these pollutants have to travel from the air into our lungs and then into different body fluids where they affect the heart's ability to regulate itself. It's a much more complicated than this simple path, of course, but there's probably nowhere in the body that's not impacted by air pollution in some way. The other challenge in understanding air pollution and health effects are that these effects occur well into the future. What I mean by that is that the pollution you're exposed to today might or might not affect you tomorrow or next week or next year. One example of this was a famous event in London in 1952, where air pollution was really bad for about 3 days. This is in December of 1952, and it caused almost immediately about 3,000 people to die, just in the span of a few days. But surprisingly, we saw increased mortality, which is death, stretching for several months after that event. In the science world, we call this a lag, and it makes it really hard to emphasize how important air pollution today is when the effect might not occur for months into the future. As humans, we're just not very good at assessing risk or planning for the future.
Right, Richard, it seems like it's an invisible ghost which is chasing everybody. It's like everywhere, touches everyone. Besides some commonly known solutions like, shifting to cleaner fuels, what are some of the steps that particularly, you think are really important, urgent, and which can help us mitigate this? Yeah,
so certainly cleaner fuels is probably the most effective way to reduce air pollution, at least at the regional and national level. But it's tricky since it's not as simple as swapping out petrol cars for EVs or installing solar panels in place of coal plants. Our infrastructure is not ready for this, and there are real issues of equity that haven't been resolved. And the technologies, while promising, aren't really there yet for global development. So we have to act more at the local level. And I see three kind of broad areas where we could do quite a bit to improve. First, we need more data on air pollution itself. And that means monitors that are operated typically by government entities to produce transparent data so we understand what air quality looks like, not just in big cities, but in rural areas, in remote locations where perhaps the population isn't highest. But we also need far more information about what happens within our cities as well, because there's an enormous amount of diversity in air quality. Even across a single city, you might see some places are 10 times more polluted than others, just as a result of local sources of pollution. Another thing we can focus on is emphasizing how important indoor air quality is. We spend 80 or 90% of our time indoors, and as a result, most of our exposure that occurs during our day occurs in the indoor environment as well. That's at our homes, in our workplaces, in our schools, where we spend much of our time. And a lot of research has not focused on indoor air quality, but there's a growing body of evidence to show us that this is really important, and this is an area where we can take action now, and we should, because most of our exposure occurs in this location. And last, there has to be an emphasis, and this is more of a policy advocacy position, is there has to be an emphasis that there are social costs to our choices that we make today, whether we're developing a new highway or putting in a new division of homes, and those social costs are borne by the future community. The people in the future who have to deal with the air quality and deal with the water quality and all the other environmental burdens that come with many of these choices. And we usually don't consider those costs today. It's not part of that calculus that we're following of building out some kind of development and recognizing that the actions we take today have an impact tomorrow. And so advocating for that position is really, really important to understand and account for the fact that we are implementing a burden onto future generations. And only then will we be able to stop this cycle of development and pollution that slows development, and we wind up in this pattern where we wind up with worsening conditions. Will we be able to resolve this and make sure that we can keep it safe for everyone into the future?
Right. So, Richard, research, policy, advocacy, but I need to come to, what I can do about it. As an individual, what do you think how can we make a difference? What can we do as individuals to become a part of the solution?
Sure. Well, policy and advocacy is certainly important, and that is something that an individual can do, and in fact should do. Often a voice is loudest when you have others with you to do that and advocate together. But on a personal level, what can you do as an individual? It's a little bit like wearing a seatbelt in a car. taking protective measures that you can do to protect yourself and your family within the environments that are within your control. The fact is, an individual probably won't be able to improve air quality across a big urban environment. They just don't have that power or ability to do so, but you can improve the air quality within your home. And that can include some things that are attainable by some. For example, the use of portable HEPA filters that might be within your apartment or your home, where you spend most of your time, or your workplace. Asking your employer, if you have one, if you have the ability to do so, to put in proper heating and ventilation systems that include filtration. But these are expensive engineering solutions, and they're not scalable to everywhere. And so eventually you wind up with very personal choices that you have to make. For example, wearing face masks. I generally don't advocate the use of face masks to mitigate air pollution, but if there are no other alternatives, that is a pretty effective strategy to do it, particularly in places where air pollution is really bad for short periods of time. I'm thinking of the couple of months in New Delhi, for example, you typically see. That's when advocating or distributing things like face masks to yourself and your family members will have some value into the future. But otherwise, what you have to do is look at your personal environment, where you spend your time, and asking yourselves what kinds of things are impacting me within my home and what can I do about it. There are lots of really great scientists across India who know a lot about this. This is my area of research, and I'm familiar with many of these great scientists. And I know all of them are willing to help communicate this message further of how one might take personal protective measures to reduce your exposure to air pollution.
Richard, people who are really passionate about, contributing to the planet, and they mean to make it their business. What advice do you have for them, the entrepreneurs who are looking to, serve some purpose and also get into the work of making it their business? How do you think they can actually make it their mission?
Sure. So, entrepreneurs can play a really important role in developing new technologies to reduce air pollution in our communities and in our homes. When I was in India in January 2024, I met so many young entrepreneurs who have really creative ideas for resolving air quality. I saw things like portable filtration systems that were designed, that were bespoke designs that they had created for Indian homes. I saw add-ons to go onto mini split heat pumps that could just go and replace that filter, and sensor companies that were measuring air quality that you could operate in your home, that you don't require sophisticated equipment and instrumentation. These are the kinds of tools that can play a really important role. When we look at the thermostat in our home and say, is it going to be hot today or cold today? That's that's a way in which you can take a protective measure to make sure you're more comfortable. You look at the thermostat and you say, it's 34 degrees out. I probably should be prepared for some heat. The same kind of thing could occur with a sensor that's reporting air quality both in an indoor environment and an outdoor environment. And so I see entrepreneurs playing a really important role in developing and implementing those kinds of strategies, building new technologies that are meant not for scientists or even policymakers, but by for your next door neighbor or your grandmother or your teenage kid or whatever it might be, that perhaps couples new technologies with things like phone apps and ways to access data in ways that a non-scientist can understand. I think if we could find a way to bring together that creativity and grit and talent, the solution to India's air quality problems is already here. It's already present in country. It just needs to coalesce, and podcasts like this are what galvanize that kind of participatory research and problem solving.
Thanks so much for that positive, boost of those last words. Very thought-provoking, and I think we have already begun. We just need to keep the pace on. And as you said, research, policy, advocacy, these are the three main areas that we must be focused on. Thank you so much, Richard.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Richard, not just for sharing your knowledge with us, but also for doing it in a way that it was very easy for me and my listeners to understand and grasp. And to all those who are tuned in, I'm sure this episode on air pollution will clear up the air on all that we can do and why we should. Entrepreneurs, the world needs your innovative solutions to cool it down. Together, let's make it our business to make the air in our cities just how we like it. On that note, this is your host, Sayema, signing off, confident that you can now take that deep breath we started with. Every step counts in cooling it down. Stay tuned for more climate connections, business ideas, and actionable steps we can all take.
Cool it down. Let's make it our business.